Zubin, why do so many people fail to learn to code?
Well, there are only three reasons why people fail: bad plan, bad execution, bad expectations.
Welcome to Easier Said Than Done with me, Zubin Pratap, where I share with you the tens of thousands of dollars worth of self-development that I did on my journey from 37-year-old lawyer to professional software engineer. The goal of this podcast is to show you how to actually do those things that are easier said than done. Hey guys, welcome back. Today I want to talk to you about the three reasons. And honestly, there are only three reasons why people fail on anything, whether it's business, whether it's to do with relationships, whether it's to do with a holiday, whether it's to do with climbing a mountain or career change, especially career change to code. Okay, there are three reasons. Now, this is a very powerful framework. And when you start to think about the challenges you're having and the reasons why you're not getting to your goal, in the context of this framework, it'll immediately help you isolate and analyze the problem, which then gives you a step to do next. Okay, so let me get started. And as always, let me share my screen. So there are only three reasons only why people end up failing. Okay, and it comes down to having the wrong plan, the wrong execution, or the wrong expectations. So let's talk about the first one. Okay, this is not going to be a very long episode because it's pretty straightforward to understand the framework. And the idea here is not to overload you with information. The idea here is to give you a simple framework that you can apply for anything. I've been using this for decades and it really helps. Okay, so number one, wrong plan, right? So what is a plan? A plan is basically a sequence of steps, okay? And it has to be an intelligent sequence of steps. And the important thing is that the sequence matters, okay? Just like a recipe, how you do things is also defined by the order in which you do it. And the result you get, just like a cooking recipe, depends on the order in which you do it. So depending on the recipe, whether it's chicken or vegetables, there's a time to add the spices, there's a time to do the other things, there's a time to soak it or marinate it, or maybe you don't, or there are things you do in the specific sequence that really matters. And of course, it's important when you actually apply the heat, right? So similarly, recipes or sequences are very important. And a plan is a well-sequenced series of steps that takes you from where you are to your goal, which is why goals matter, right? So the plan that is not directed at a specific goal is not a plan at all. And a goal that is not specific is not a goal at all, right? So a goal needs to be specific. Now, a lot of people have talked about SMART goals: specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-bound. Realistic is a subjective thing. The rest of it, I think, is pretty clear. So, it needs to be specific, measurable, and actionable, especially, right? And time-bound is only a way for us to drive more discipline in ourselves. It's not important for the goal itself. So goals matter. And the more precise you are, the better. So a lot of people, for example, say, hey, I want to go to Canada. Okay. Actually, you don't want to go to most of Canada. You want to go to some of the bigger cities, perhaps, or specific places in Canada. You would not be happy if your pilot took you to some other place in Canada that you didn't intend to go. So clearly, specificity matters, okay? Even though you may think of it in vague terms, when you're deciding to take action, you need to get super specific. So goals matter. Now, for the plan or recipe, think about it like navigation, like your Google Maps or your Apple Maps, okay? Once you have your goal, you now need a starting point, a defined and clearly assessed starting point. I spend a lot of my time with my students doing this for the first month or so when students come to me for career change coaching, because it's really important to get the goals right, the starting point matters, so that we can then build the implementation plan, which is the right sequence, right? So the starting point is really important, and you need to have an honest and objective appraisal of where you're starting at, okay? A lot of people, especially in the coding space, come to me, and it's quite surprising, to be honest, telling me, oh, they're pretty intermediate at code. Why? Because they've done some HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and they're like, that's kind of beginner level. Intermediate is actually much higher than you realize, but if you don't know how high the mountain is, you're going to think you're further up the mountain than you actually are, and that's going to be very dangerous, probably fatal for your plan, because your starting point is all wrong, okay? Now, it's really important, given I've given you all these map analogies, to remind you and to remind myself that the map is not the territory. There's this old saying, right? The map is not the territory. What that means is, when you look at a map, you don't actually know what the actual territory is going to be like. Sure, you may have some of the basic ideas that if it's a really detailed map, you have more detail in it. But looking at the map and thinking that's how the terrain is actually going to be is a big mistake, okay? The map is a guidance tool. It's a navigation tool. It's not a substitute or an exact replica of what the real world's going to look like. Now, the map is not the territory, I think, is a military history phrase, because as you can imagine, in military history, it really mattered that people didn't think the map was going to have all the information and that the real life experience is going to be the same as looking at the map. It's not, right? So For the map to be useful, you also need to have insight into the territory. Again, a lot of lessons from military history here, right? You need to have actual insight into the industry. In military history, they use spies to get greater details to increase the value of the map, right? And the greater quality of the intelligence, the information on the enemy territory. So similarly, when you're trying to enter into a new territory, a new career, or whatever it is, you need to have a lot of insight into that industry before you build your plan. Now, here's a classic example of why people do this wrong. Recently, a friend of mine mentioned that his parent had written a book. And this is a wonderful person, an incredibly bright person, and they've written the book. And the first and only step that people tend to think about is, well, I thought writing the book is going to be the hardest part. And actually, that's the easiest part, right? When you think about, well, I'm going to write a book, what is the thought? I'm going to write a book. But that's one of the intentions. But note how it's very vague. To be really specific, it needs to be, well, I'm going to write a book and then I'm going to get it published, right? And it turns out that editing it and then getting an agent and then marketing it and publishing it are way harder than writing the book, right? Often it takes people 2 to 3 times do all that stuff compared to writing the book, right? So if it takes a year to write the book, it could take a year or 2 to just market it and publish it and get it out in the market. So that's twice as long as it took to write the book. And that's an example of the map not being the territory. Now you may say, okay, I have all these steps. And in fact, in a future episode, I'm going to talk about the 7 stages, the 7 steps to career change to code or anything else. There are 7 steps, right? And most people focus on one because they confuse the map with the territory, or they think, just like writing a book, that writing a book is all about writing the book. The real goal is not to write the book. The real goal is not to learn to code. The real goal is to get published, or in the coding world, the real goal is to get hired as a professional developer. Writing the book is like learning to code. It's just the first step of many, and it's not enough to get to your actual goal, right? So this is exactly why having the wrong plan is one of the major reasons people fail. Now, next is wrong execution. So this is assuming that you actually have a good plan. Okay, assuming your plan is viable, then you execute it incorrectly. And usually, wrong execution is a symptom of not enough detail in the plan. So it's arguably a symptom of your plan being viable, but not of great quality, right? It's a correct plan, but it's not detailed enough. And so that'll cause wrong execution. Typically, wrong execution is too little of a critical input. Now, this could be time, energy, the right kind of material, doing the right things at the right time. So all of these are critical inputs, right? Timing, the quality of the input, the timing of the input, the amount of effort involved, all of that is critical inputs. And so you could lack the critical inputs in sufficient quantity. Think of it this way. If you're doing a long journey and you're doing it on half tank of gas and you do run out of gas, that's not the journey's fault. It's not even the map's fault. It's because the critical input was missing, okay? Or you set out to buy a house and you completely read the market wrong and you just don't have enough money for it, right? In that case, you have a critical input that's missing or insufficient. Typically, in the context of career change or learning to code or complex transitions like that, the critical input is missing, and it's usually effort, time, or money, right? These are the 3 currencies that we all have to spend: time, effort, money. These are the 3 investments we all need to make to achieve anything we want in life. And so typically the critical input is missing because of indiscipline, laziness, focus, or you just didn't know, right? I didn't know this was a critical input, right? So these are common reasons: indiscipline, laziness, focus, ignorance, also environmental factors. So for example, parents need to make a very different plan. And this is how I work with the students in my program: is I customize it based on their context, their environmental factors. Parents or people with heavy duty dependencies have a very different context, and therefore critical inputs are harder for them to sustainably put in, right? So I need to make a plan around that. Or some people, especially people who don't have families and lots of free time, have a lack of accountability, too much time on social media, or they're not able to measure their progress in any meaningful terms. They have terrible time management, poor energy management, very bad focus, and so on and so forth. So everybody's context is different, and you need to optimize your critical inputs based on your particular context. That's why the second part is important, because wrong execution can come out from environmental factors a lot of the times. The last reason why execution of plans can be incorrect is because of what's known as closed feedback loop. A closed feedback loop is a feedback loop that doesn't have external inputs into it to refresh it and give it new data, okay? So classic closed feedback loops could be certain kinds of learning environments. So for example, a very common symptom that people complain to me about is, oh, I'm in tutorial hell. I've done lots of Codecademy. but I can't actually build anything from scratch. Or I've done a bunch of Udemy courses and I can't build anything from scratch, right? This is because these are closed feedback loops. You do what's there in the program. It's the same for everybody. You have limited access to anybody to speak to, if at all you have any access, and you literally follow along. And maybe it's updated, maybe it's outdated, we don't know. But then you learn a bunch of syntax and you have some literacy, but because there's no feedback into what actual building of software looks like, you don't build a skill. So you get literacy and not a skill because the feedback loop is closed. There's no one there to tell you how you're going to apply this to make it a skill. What do you need to build skills, right? Because you need to build things to build a skill at building things. That's a closed feedback loop. A lot of these learning environments online, especially the cheap ones, they're not worried, or let me put it this way. The reason they're cheap is because they mass market. And if they mass market, they can't give you too many feedback loops, because feedback loops takes a lot of time and energy and focus and attention, one-to-one, or, in small groups or whatever it is. So it's not scalable. And so therefore they give you the literacy stuff because that's scalable. It's basically they're taking things out of a textbook and put it in a prettier format. That's often what happens in these closed learning environments. Another form of closed feedback loops is where there's a standard process for doing something, and that process doesn't get regular feedback from external situations like the market. Classic examples are curricula in colleges and boot camps, etc. Right? They're fixed. The reason they're fixed is because then it's easier to scale it. It's like a factory. If there's a fixed process, you can do more units of production, so to speak. And standardization works for cars and factory items, but it's not great for education for this reason, in that it loses touch with the market, which we've all seen with college education traditionally, and now we're seeing with boot camps. Everybody learns the same thing, everybody teaches the same thing, and so everybody start to look the same, and then no one stands out in the market. It disconnects you from the market in terms of what's happening in the market, and the trends in the market do not get reflected because the curriculum is so fixed that it's hard. It takes time to change things. We see this in school and colleges all the time. By the time they change things, everything's outdated again. So it doesn't keep up with a fast changing market. That's a closed feedback loop because the feedback loop is internal and disconnected from the market. So just to summarize, wrong execution of a decent plan can happen because not enough detail in the plan, not enough critical inputs in the plan, and not enough critical inputs are largely contextual and circumstantial, or I'm just not aware this is a critical input and so I never put it in. This can happen a lot. Another reason for wrong execution is the closed feedback loop, and the closed feedback loops are from systems where there's a standardization of the process, or there's a scaling of the process that disconnects it from what's actually happening in the industry, and therefore the feedback loop doesn't include and incorporate new fresh data as and when it becomes relevant, and then that produces things like a standard output, or a standard output plus only literacy and not enough skills at actually building things, which is classically proven when people have a symptom like, well, I have spent 6 months learning a whole bunch of these languages, and I can do it when the environment is right, but then I can't actually build anything from scratch. That is the classic closed feedback loop problem. Now, the third reason why your plan could fail is having the wrong expectations. So let's assume you have the right plan and you have good execution. You've set up the systems correctly, you have open feedback loops, and you have your context and circumstances designed and curated in such a way that it enables you to actually execute on a good plan, okay? So you can do the right execution and you have the right plan. Now, you may have the wrong expectations. And this is again a classic symptom of the problem of mistaking the map for the territory, right? So you think that, oh, now that I've got a plan, now that I've got the right execution, it's just going to all fall into place. And that's not true. Or you think it's going to be super easy and super quick, and that's simply not true, right? Often this can also happen because of the assumptions that we make based on social media influencer posts, which is a more modern problem, but it's still, and it's actually quite a serious problem because there's so many people out there saying, this is what I did, so it'll work for you. That's not true. Just because somebody does something doesn't mean it's going to work for you. In fact, 9 times out of 10, it was their context that made that thing work for them, not the thing itself. Okay, so the fact that they did a certain kind of JavaScript or a certain program or a certain bootcamp or a certain college or did it themselves or whatever is only evidence that it worked in their combination of circumstances. Another big assumption that people make is, that the social media stream is actually evidence. For example, a lot of what we see in social media is that lots of people are self-taught, and it may seem like that. For example, if I show you 100 people, which by the way is a lot, I don't know 100 people are self-taught. I know maybe 8 or 10, but let's say I showed you 100 people are self-taught. That sounds like a lot of people. Sure, but there are 40, 50 million developers in the world, right? So that is a tiny fraction of people who actually made it to development who are self-taught. Now, I also have another problem. All the people who are self-taught but never made it to developers, which is the vast majority, aren't in that data set. So now, sure, there are 50 million developers, out of which maybe 100 were self-taught that we know about in social media, and thousands, perhaps even millions, were trying to be self-taught and never made it. Okay, so the real data says something else. So never make assumptions based on social media. Look for actual data. If there is a huge number of people who are actually getting trained in some way to do it, there is a reason for it. It just increases your success rate. Okay, another thing, social media will tell you learning some HTML or SQL or Python is all that matters. It's simply not true. No one's ever gotten a job for basic literacy. No one's ever going to get a job for basic literacy, especially not in a complex tech world. Okay, and it's not about the languages. So this is another assumption that people have, is that, okay, I've got a plan, and this wrong expectation can create the wrong plan. You see how all of these elements, these three elements, the wrong plan, the execution, the expectations, are all linked. The wrong expectations, lack of industry insight, are all things that can make a bad plan, right? And even if you do happen to luckily stumble upon a good plan, it can't be because somebody else put it on a blog somewhere. It's unlikely to be right for you because it may not help you execute it correctly. And even if you execute it somewhat correctly, if you have the wrong expectations, it'll cause impatience, frustration, or discouragement because you have the wrong expectations, and it'll make you fail. Okay, so another very popular one that really annoys me is, we can learn to code in 90 days or 120 days or 150 days. It makes no sense. Okay, if you do 1 hour a day, even for 150 days, that's 150 hours. If I do 10 hours a day for 150 days, that's 1,500 hours. Who do you think is more likely to get the role, right? Obviously, the person who does the 1,500 hours, not the 150 hours. So measuring things by days makes no sense. And again, that's a wrong expectation. That's disconnected from the execution. Execution being how many hours per day are you doing, right? So if you're doing 10 hours a day, then yeah, maybe 150 days is very realistic, is quite achievable, provided you have the right plan to actually get interviews. It's one thing to learn the skill, it's a different thing to get interviews, right? So all these social media assumptions, just stay away from them, because if they're giving you information that's not clearly thought out, that's not based on direct experience, or that reflects only their experience, then it's probably not going to work for you. And that's the nature of reality. Okay, when people ask me about how I get into Google, I tell them it's irrelevant. I can tell you how I do it, and I've talked about it, I've written about it in Free Code Camp, etc. I talk about it and I do share it, but I always say this worked for me, okay, because it was a specific set of circumstances. I know how to do it for other people. I've helped other people do it, lots of people in 8 countries. So I know how to help other people do it, but I can tell you every single one of them at a different context, a different execution, a different plan, and I had to set their expectations based on their temperament and their circumstances. I've had people in small countries with no local tech market, and their expectations are very different. Okay, it's not going to happen in 6 months. I've had people in the middle of San Francisco or Seattle where you can have tons of more strong expectations and much better results faster because the market's different. But the plan has to be tailored to the situation you're in. Okay, now, the final wrong expectation I want to talk about is that most people seem to assume that if they're finding it really hard, there's something wrong with the material or there's something wrong with the instructor, as opposed to that thing is just really hard. There is a third option, which is hard things are hard, and you're finding this hard because this is a hard thing, not because the material is shit, not because the instructor is shit. You know what I mean? So that's another wrong expectation that people have. And what this results in, this particular expectation, is that this causes people to jump around, right? They keep looking for the next thing. They keep looking for the next shiny object, the next sugary hit, the next framework, the next influencer, the next blog, the next book, whatever it is to jump into, because the existing one feels too hard, when actually even the new one's going to feel that hard because the topic is that hard. This is not to say that some instructors, some materials aren't better than others. They absolutely are. They absolutely are. But unfortunately, when you don't know the topic, you're not in a position to assess the teacher that much. 9 times out of 10. Like if they're really bad, they're clearly bad. But a good teacher who's not getting results may not be because of the teacher. It may be because the thing is just that hard and you're not putting in the right inputs, the right execution into that plan. So covering a lot here. Like I said, it's a really important topic. There are really only 3 things: wrong plan, wrong execution, wrong expectations. If you can diagnose what the problem is, and it's usually a combination of all 3, and then tweak it, you'll get much closer to your goals. Hope that helped, and I'll see you next time.
Do it. Just subscribe. You know you got to do it.